Hello, those of you who are coming in, welcome. We'll give it a couple of minutes before we start to give people time to come in. Okay, I'm just slowly starting the seminar and introducing our guests, and by the time we'll be starting the talk, I hope a couple more people might have joined us. So welcome everyone to this Gender Studies Network seminar. I'm really pleased that we're having this seminar. All the planned seminars fell in on strike days this term in February, March. So unfortunately, 3 of our events were cancelled because of that. Nevertheless, we have been persistent and managed to get Sumi Madhok to present her work here still in this May date. For those of you who are not familiar with the Gender Studies Network, please look us up on Twitter and Facebook and on the website of King's College London. And if you want to be more active, drop me an email, please. You're very welcome. So today we have Sumi Madhok, Professor of Political Theory and Gender Studies at the Department of Gender Studies at LSE. And I'm really very pleased that she's here to present her new book, Vernacular Rights Cultures. Now, Sumi is an anti-colonial, transnational and interdisciplinary scholar, and particularly because she is a political theorist and a philosopher, but at the same time very interested in feminist ethnographies. So she's thinking through coloniality, transnational activism and social movements, rights and citizenship. And that is very much what her book, Vernacular Rights Cultures, is about, as a contribution to thinking about human rights struggles from below. Human rights, including feminism, are very often considered to be historically located in the West, to be Eurocentric, and such depictions have considerable effects on our understanding of the possibilities, nature, and location of human rights activism. And Sumi challenges these notions using political theory, philosophy, and importantly, ethnography to discuss human rights discourse from below. And I'm really interested in hearing her version of this and based on the book. Now, we've invited, and really pleased that she accepted, Rafeef Ziada to act as a discussant today. Rafeef is a lecturer in politics and public policy at the Department of International Development here at King's, and her research focuses on political economy, gender and race, with a particular focus on the Middle East and East Africa. And she's the co-author of the wonderful collection of essays and interviews, Revolutionary Feminisms. And as co-editor of that book, Rafeef presented her work last year in the Gender Studies Network. So welcome, Rafeef. Really pleased that you're now sitting on our side of the Gender Studies Networks and of King's, as in the meantime, you joined us. So I'm really grateful to both of you for joining us today. I'm Jelke Boston. I am a professor of gender and development at the Department of International Development, and I will be chairing this session. First, Sumi will speak for about 30-35 minutes about her work, and then we'll invite Rafif to respond to that, and then there will be time for Q&A. The Q&A is being organized because this is a formal seminar. Settings is organized via the chat function, but we'll get there when we'll get there. So let's first jump in and invite Sumi to present her book, Vernacular Rights Cultures.
Thank you so much, Jelke. Such a lovely and thoughtful introduction, really. It's always so lovely when, when your work is represented back at you and you think, oh, did I really do all of those things? Did I really think about it like that? How nice. Because a book project, like any other writing project, is such an anxious one, right? So it's always very nice to, have such wonderful interlocutors, and it's really lovely to be here with you all this afternoon. Thanks so much for coming, all of you who are here. I know it's very hard to fit extra things in these very difficult and strange times, and time of kind of unending grief, really, in so many different ways. And so this is really, really a treat, and I'm so grateful to you all. A book conversation, especially, and I call it a conversation because today is a conversation, especially after the book's been published, is something of a paradoxical exercise, really, mainly because the publication marks the end of the project, and in many ways, and marks the end of the steam and the ambition that has driven the project over the many years it has taken to do and to write it. But however, I've really written the book and and continue to think of it as an invitation for different conversations, as some of which that Jelke was talking about, and really as a springboard for those other scholarships on rights politics and human rights to take off. And so it's really in that spirit of opening up avenues for thinking and exciting conversations that I'm here to have a conversation this afternoon. Very many thanks again, Jelke and the Gender Studies Network at King's College for making this event happen, despite so many different other things happening in the world. Oh, yay, we're here this afternoon. So that's a mark of feminist grit and perseverance, isn't it? Right. And also a special thanks to Leah Happ for all the logistics this afternoon, and of course to my wonderful discussant Rafif Ziadeh, whose book is here, that that Jelke was mentioning today, and I cannot even begin to tell you how excited I am right now as I'm speaking. So I'm going to start the share. So I have a few slides. I thought, books are kind of, multi-layered projects. So I should just have just to kind of move us along, have a few slides. And so can I just start the share now? Will that be okay? Okay, great. So let me start the share. I'm not really going to do a conventional book talk, right, in the conventional sense, because it's, Jelke mentioned, it's going to not be really more than 33, 34, 35 minutes, because I want to hear Rafif and I want to hear all of you, really. And so what I want to do instead is really talk about some of the key questions that drive or drove the writing of the book, or drive the book, as it were. And at this point, before I move on, I wanted to kind of draw your attention to the book cover, which is right here, which is spread across your pages. And I'll come back to the book cover in a bit, but I just want to say to you at this point that the cover actually does crucial work in the book, right? It does particular kinds of work, and in some ways the clues are in the cover, and it gives it away, and gives the game away, if you like, if you look at it carefully enough. So going to the big main questions then that I was saying I was going to really flag today, perhaps the biggest question that the book sets out to ask really is this: how to tell stories of rights politics in most of the world, and how to tell different stories of rights and rights politics, how to tell stories of rights and human rights that are not only ever those of their origins or of the powerful efforts by the powerful, including by nation states, to institutionalize global human rights, or of their unidirectional travel, translation, and vernacularization in other worlds, or indeed those by humanitarian and military intervention by global powers. And how not to tell stories of different human rights, where difference is enacted through categorizing difference as cultural, custom, or as case studies of global human rights talk, and how to then refuse standardly narrated stories of human rights that speak of difference while keeping the epistemic frameworks of global human rights talk intact and impervious to any serious consideration of the difference that historical and political difference makes to global rights talk. In short, how to tell other stories of world making and meaning making on rights without either reproducing the vast epistemic power and time-space provincialism of global human rights discourse, or compromising the complexity, dynamism, difference, and epistemic and political struggles for rights and human rights in most of the world. Now, for some years now, I have been insistent to tell a different story of world making around rights and human rights, and I tell a story of vernacular rights cultures. Now, these stories of vernacular rights cultures foreground the struggles for rights and justice by subaltern groups in most of the world. These are stories of critical conceptual vocabularies, of subaltern mobilisations, of conflictual gendered politics of rights, and they're stories of struggles for economic redistributive justice, but also for representational justice. And they are stories of conceptual diversity, of oppositional politics, of protest against authoritarianism and militarism, and of the political imaginaries that animate subaltern rights politics, but also open up different futures and possibilities for rights and human rights around the globe. Importantly, then, these stories refuse the racialized, originary, and binary global human rights talk, or what I have called the politics of origins. Now, driving the scholarship on global human rights is an inordinate preoccupation with what I call the politics of origins, which is really a racialized and a binary global human rights discourse, which stipulates that human rights originate, belong, travel from, and operate for the West. Now, this politics of origins is shared by not only celebrators and detractors of human rights, but also by critical and progressive scholarship on human rights. The politics of origins puts in place particular forms of racial, epistemic, and political erasures. The story of politics of origins, of course, we know from fantastic scholarship in the last decade or so, and even longer, is first and foremost a racial story. As scholars have noted, institutional histories of racism and settler colonialism haunt historical, philosophical, and legal accounts of human rights. In more recent times, the politics of origins contributes to eclipsing the role of anti-colonial movements against imperial powers, even though, and this is the paradoxical moment really, even though the right to self-determination is a core human right, and these accounts preferring to focus on the role of Western lawmakers and peacemakers, but also on epistemically silencing the scale and momentum of contemporary rights mobilizations and claim making across the globe. Important among them, of course, long-standing resistance against settler colonial and racist colonial heteropatriarchal statecraft. Significantly, the politics of origins organizes the global human rights discourse into a series of binary distinctions. And this is really familiar. I mean, this is like almost like, I don't know, sliced bread, to kind of use a hackneyed kind of term and metaphor, is really, and this is the stuff of, curricula. This is the stuff of what's taught to kind of first year, maybe graduate students or undergraduate students reading human rights. So global human rights discourse is organized around into a series of binary distinctions, key ones being West, non-West, universalism versus cultural particularism, Asian values versus Western political and civil human rights, and so on. Now, the binarism of rights talk has led to a spectacular failure to pay attention to the forms of rights politics, the political cultures, and the modes of activism engaged by and in subaltern groups in most of the world, not least by nation states who have deployed the binarisms of rights talk spectacularly mainly to silence democratic aspirations to great effect. And so the politics of origins, of course, is not without consequences. In the hands of the detractors, and particularly authoritarian nation states, it places a politically expedient argument to delegitimize modes of protest and questioning of excessive state power on the basis that human rights are illegitimate, alien, foreign, and therefore with little cultural traction and legitimacy. And in critical progressive scholarship on human rights, on the other hand, this originary story shores up the West as the epistemic subject of human rights, although this time via critique and through willful ignorance of and historical amnesia around rights struggles in most of the world. I often tell my students, for example, you can be the most critically sophisticated critical theorist of rights, right? And not be expected to know anything about rights politics in most of the world. And this is how that kind of willful ignorance works. Now, I want to draw your attention at this point to a specific effect of the politics of origins, which is its pervasive time-space provincialism, of historiographical, philosophical, and moral time-space provincialism that characterizes human rights scholarship. By time-space provincialism, I simply mean that the epistemic center of human rights intellectual thinking is temporally and geographically located in the West. So even if the timeline of the originary stories of human rights might shift, and this is what we see in the last 10, 12 years, this is the kind of scholarship whereby, well, let's not go back to the French revolutions and American Declaration and so on. Let's look at Amnesty International, right? So the origin stories of human rights has kind of moved and so on. So even if the timeline shifts, the location of human rights stories remains steadfastly in place, with the result that the geopolitical context of epistemic inquiry remains stationary. Now, the important work that this time-space provincialism does is that it invests epistemic authority in the global north, thereby leading to a lack of theoretical, philosophical, and conceptual attention to rights struggles in the global south. The widespread time-space provincialism in human rights scholarship shows up in its predominant focus on post-World War II Anglo-European American stories of growth and spread of global governance, international law, international institutions, global histories and politics of neoliberalism, globalization, global NGOs, and of course, of accounts explicitly focused on the pursuit of global justice and Western-sponsored international humanitarianism. Now, these dominant stories of human rights that populate conservative and liberal accounts, but are also rehearsed by radical democratic theorists, have led to a widespread acceptance of what I call the depoliticization thesis, that not only silences and eclipses accounts of the ongoing mobilizations for rights in most of the world, but has also resulted in the absence of at least two kinds of inquiries. First, it has meant that human rights or rights mobilizations in most of the world have yet to centrally preoccupy scholarship on human rights, which is predominantly focused on the North Atlantic or the European experience of the right to have rights, and the paradoxes and aporias resulting from the founding or originary moments of republicanism, that is on the abstract, theoretical, and philosophical problems set off by the French and the American revolutions. Second, despite the growing awareness for a need of scholarly work on rights and human rights in different parts of the globe, there exists a striking lack of scholarship that is explicitly aimed at not only tracking alternative genealogies of human rights, but also producing conceptual work that captures the stakes and struggles over rights and human rights, besides being able to critically engage, challenge, and speak back to the scholarly field of global human rights. Now, the point I'm making here is that, crucially, theoretical and philosophical critique of global human rights alone cannot account, although it's very important, that critique, cannot account for the life world of struggles for rights and entitlements, particularly subaltern struggles, or indeed for the critical vocabulary and political grammar within which these struggles and demands are articulated. For quite simply, the terms of critique of global human rights has been, as I was sort of saying before, has been such that they end up resurrecting and reproducing the object of their critiques, i.e. the West, where all of this stand by a critique. Critiques, again, and this is quite important to keep saying this, although hugely useful and significant in demystifying the constellations of power and their entanglements, must only be the starting point for the production of new intellectual and conceptual histories, geographies, and epistemologies of rights from different locations, including subaltern locations around the globe. Now it turns out that you can't simply tell these different stories that I've been wanting to talk about and to tell about rights politics in most of the world without also engaging seriously with the question of global epistemic justice. By global epistemic justice, I mean to take seriously epistemic interventions from the global south in a way that matter epistemically. So not as case studies, as I was saying earlier, not as local variant of the global or culturalized away as custom or vernacularized, but as speaking aside, speaking back, and so on. By epistemic justice, I also mean to critique the hardwired colonial unknowing and methodological insularity within scholarships on politics of global justice, but also and rights on the one hand, but also the methodological nationalism when people do talk about world making in the global south. The problem with methodological nationalism, but also the great men's stories, whenever people are talking about the global south and so on, they suddenly, start talking about great men's stories and their histories and their interventions, is that not only are nation states among the chief violators of rights through their security, development, and corporate apparatus and interests, but also because of the low legitimacy of nation states to represent subaltern groups who have historically been at the receiving end of irresistible state violence. So key to global epistemic justice are questions of epistemic presence and epistemic accounting. And both of these have preoccupied me for a long time. And I argue in the book that the epistemic presence of rights politics in most of the world must insist on an epistemic accounting of this rights politics, the stakes and struggles that animate this politics, the conceptual repertoires that informs it, as well as the rights subjects that come into being in the wake of this rights politics. The appearance of rights politics in most of the world as an epistemic presence is crucial for shifting the epistemic center of knowledge production on global human rights. Now, I've been tracking rights politics by subaltern groups, especially within large mobilizations for best part of 2 decades now. But it was clear to me that in order to give an epistemic accounting and about this rights politics, I could not use the global human rights framework, as that would be to activate the charge of a technical application of theory, but also invoke the serious charge of reproducing and authorizing the epistemic and geopolitical power of global human rights discourse. And so clearly I needed to find another way of entering this field of rights politics without either, as I was saying, reproducing the huge epistemic power of global human rights discourse, and without minimizing or compromising the dynamism and the epistemic presence of these mobilizations. And I'm just trying to see if I can get this. And so in order to give an epistemic accounting of this politics of rights, I've had to devise both a theoretical framework for this study, which I've called Vernacular Rights Cultures, which is the title of the book, but also a methodological device to study it, because of course, you might ask me, well, that's all very good, you've got a framework, but how do you actually go about studying this, right? And the methodological device, which I called feminist historical ontology. And I'll come back to this, and I'll come back to feminist historical ontology in a bit. So thinking through and with the lens of vernacular rights cultures then allows the curation, assembly, documentation of different registers, imaginaries, and possibilities of and for rights encounters and politics in the world. These different registers interrupt state-centric, but also well-rehearsed originary stories of temporalities, global institutional histories, and abstract subjectivities, which are all the staple of global human rights discourse, to generate instead historically specific discourses of rights, replete with their own languages of claim-making, subjectification, and world-making. But you might ask how to insist on this epistemic presence of rights politics in most of the world. Sumi, you're talking about epistemic presence and epistemic accounting, but how does one do that? An important way to do this is to insist on producing conceptual descriptions of the languages of rights and human rights deployed across the globe that attend to the critical vocabularies, political activisms, and different philosophical perspectives that animate rights politics. It bears worth repeating, and I guess I haven't said that before, but I should just say it again, that the production of concepts from most of the world is a matter of urgency. We simply do not have the concepts we need to produce theorized accounts of our different and historically specific encounters in the world. Concepts are the building blocks of theory. Concepts help us to enable us to visualize and describe the world. Right. And if those are not in place, then all kinds of forms of violence, epistemic violence, forms of misdescriptions, misrepresentations occur all the time. The vernacular in vernacular rights cultures is also an epistemic positioning. It flags an epistemic position in relation to the hegemonic global human rights discourse, but it also flags the different literal and conceptual languages of rights deployed by subaltern groups across the globe. And at this point, let me see if I can take you back to the cover of the book that I said right at the beginning. That might be, that is quite important. So as you will see from the cover of the book, that the word hak is written across it in 8 different languages. And those of you who read those languages don't need me to tell you this, but anyway, those languages are Hebrew, Hindi, Manipuri, Persian, Swahili, Turkish, Urdu, and Arabic. As I said, those of you who read these languages know that the word hak is the principal word for a right in all of these languages. The word itself is traced to classical Hebrew and appears in pre-Islamic poetry and then in the Quran, and it's also found in the older Semitic languages of Aramaic, Mandaean. And over the centuries, the word has traveled across the continent to become the principal word to signify right in South Asia, the Middle East, North Africa. Hak, written in various different ways, appears in Hindustani and Urdu lexicon through the influence of Persian in the Indian subcontinent, where it cuts across geographical, religious, and linguistic boundaries to become the principal word deployed to claim rights by subaltern groups in both Northwest India and Pakistan. Evidently, the word is remarkably cosmopolitan and has an epistemic presence across 2 continents and 8 languages and counting. These are the languages that appear in the book that I have tracked, right? Well, it appears in various other languages too. And so in my work, I have taken my cue from the principal word, as I said, which signifies a right in South Asia, which is hak. And the word hak is hardly confined to South Asia alone. It does not recognize national borders and formations. If anything, it undermines these. And now let's see if we can go back to some of the PowerPoints back. So I've been ethnographically tracking and documenting the critical vocabularies and deployments of the word hak in subaltern movements, including indigenous and Dalit mobilizations demanding right to food, employment, public information, accountability, and land rights in India and in Pakistan. And I just wanted to kind of, put a PowerPoint here so that it shows you the work, the tracking that I've been doing, as I said, for nearly 2 decades now. In India, I've mostly been tracking it across Rajasthan, in northwestern India, across citizen mobilizations, and in Pakistan, the Anjuman Mazareen, or the Tenants Association of Punjab and Rural, which is a movement in rural Punjab, which has emerged as the most significant working class movement in Punjab, which, in Pakistan actually, contesting, which has openly contested the power of the military. So Pakistan, hak operates as a normative concept that exists within complex and capacious imaginaries that are juridical but also political. And my conceptual work on hak has involved documenting the different justificatory premises of hak that animate but also sustain political mobilizations while also putting in place a particular relation to oneself. Now, these justificatory premises, as I show in the book, intersect with liberal democratic theorizing on rights and human rights, but also turn away towards a very radical direction. And the 4 justificatory premises, I'm going to go through them very quickly, that I've documented across the movements, are citizenship. So on what are the bases on which hak is kind of justified and claimed, right? And so citizenship on the basis of a cosmological right as an Islamic ideal and as a moral ideal as truth. And some of the things that have emerged from sort of thinking about hak conceptually is, what does it do to thinking about rights, right? To the framework of thinking about rights, particularly within, say, analytical philosophy, because that's where a lot of that work is being done. First of all, one of the things that comes through is that Haq is non-derivative from the state. Now, this is quite an important intervention because in liberal democratic theory, there is an umbilical connection between the state and rights, right? So state and citizenship, so rights are attached very much to citizenship. And, so those questions which are very integral to rights, where do rights come from? Where do they get their authority from? Who has rights? Who do rights belong to? And on what basis are they justified? All of those questions are quite, differently oriented here because rights are seen as non-derivative from the state. So Haq as a concept is non-derivative from the state, but even though it's non-derivative, Haq or rights require implementation from the state and hence the mobilization, right? And so Haq is dynamic and has justifications independent of the state. So Haq then in that moment doesn't only posit symmetric and correlative relations between itself and the positive legal order of the state, it exists independent of law and has a moral authority of its own. Now, this is quite different from, a lot of philosophical thinking whereby rights only exist if they exist in law. Right. And so there's that distinction between legal rights and moral rights. And those kinds of distinctions are kind of elided here. Unlike moral individualism espoused by dominant thinking, Haq is not only the moral property of self-regarding subjects. So it doesn't only engage in establishing dual correlatives between pairs of individuals, but signifies relational connections and so non-dichotomous relations between the individual and the public good are established. And that idea of the collective, right, is very strongly coming through, and therefore you see that in the collective mobilization. So one of the things about rights politics is that somehow it can undermine collective mobilizations of various kinds. And so it also signifies a cosmic inseparability and indivisibility of individuals from the public good. And this is very much coming through tracking Haq within indigenous mobilizations and in mobilizations of Adivasi groups. One more thing, neither humanism or moral sovereignty of individuals or their interests, whether collective or individual underpin the justification of Haq. So in that sense, humanism is not the be and end all of rights politics. A lot of rights philosophical thinking will sort of say, well, at the end of the day, rights belongs to sentient beings. So Haq operates instead to uphold a cosmological and a normative order that includes duties to protect nature and duties to nature. So it exceeds humanism and is not only confined or consistent with humanism. So Haq is a dynamic but not a horizontal concept. And I think this is really important. This is not a panacea. This is not free from power relations and so on and so forth, but it just suggests that there are alternative ways in which mobilizations and collective claims are made against the state. So for example, Haq for women has to be begged separately in all my tracking of subaltern political struggles. I've never come across a single articulation where rights for women, I'm not even talking about sexuality, all right? I'm talking about simply women's rights having to be begged separately, tagged along, attached, never emerging organically within these mobilizations. And so brings together, but Haq is capacious enough to bring together the politics of rights with the politics of justice. And this is something quite important because rights and human rights are not the politics of justice, right? So politics of human rights is not the politics of justice. We see this across the globe. Whereas you see in these claim making, you see the kind of potential or the insistence of bringing together the politics of rights with the politics of justice. So how to then study this, right? So I was talking about feminist historical ontology right in the beginning to sort of say the methodological device. And so I've had to do this because, as I said, to avoid the kinds of epistemic erasures and the ready-made traps that culturalize epistemic difference away, converted into local or as case studies of global human rights. And for that, I've had to come up with a set of methodological tools for studying rights politics in which the world, which I call feminist historical ontology. So feminist historical ontology couples investigations into historical ontology with the critical reflexive politics of location. Right, so it brings together the work on historical ontology, particularly the work of the philosopher Ian Hacking. For Ian Hacking, a concept is but a word in its sights, right? So concepts are very historically and politically located. And for him, and I think that, and historical ontology is actually a term that's used by Foucault in his piece on what is enlightenment. In fact, Foucault refers to it, I think, twice and then never again. In all of his oeuvre. He mentions it twice in What is Enlightenment when he talks about describing his own work. And he sort of says, my work is historical, ontological. And Hacking picks up that, that idea of historical ontology and kind of takes it in a very interesting direction and looks at the, you know, the coming into being of concepts. You know, that's the thing about epistemic erasure, right? Epistemic erasure of feminist scholarship. Feminist scholarship has been talking about the politics of location and the historical and, you know, the political sort of location of concepts. And of course, that's never cited in the work on historical ontology. So a feminist historical ontology then couples the work of historical ontology with a critical reflexive politics of location. A feminist historical ontology then allows us to examine how concepts come into being in particular locations, produce specific political cultures and make up people, while also putting in place different possibilities for justice and for different possibilities for justice and democracies. Particularly tracks processes of political subjectivation and how gendered subjects of rights come into being in the vernacular. So towards the end, I just want to, I think I might have 4 or 5 minutes. Am I right, Yelke, or do I have less?
No, you have definitely 5 minutes.
Okay, I have definitely 5 minutes. So
yeah.
Okay, so towards the end, now let me just say a few things to wrap up. And just a few things to note about vernacular rights cultures. So vernacular rights cultures are no authentic or pure hermetically sealed sites in the global south. Okay, so I want you to dispel any idea that these might be that. In fact, quite the converse. The coercive entanglements of the histories of colonialism, together with the penetrative capacities of state developmentalism and transnational capital, have not only rendered talk of authenticity impossible, but have also at the same time laid bare the magnitude of epistemic and ontological violence unleashed on subaltern groups by nation states. These rights cultures are co-produced and invoked within multiple and diverse encounters with developmentalism, corporatism, statism, legal constitutionalism, and activism. And therefore it's militarism, and I could go on. Therefore it's at the intersection of these and not as some free standing abstraction that Haq, as a contemporary idea in South Asia, operates. And developmentalism and dispossession, at least in the mobilizations I've been looking at, constitute important sites of subaltern rights talk in South Asia. So the materiality to this rights talk is really important. And so, yes, we talk about conceptual work, but conceptual work doesn't happen in a political or material vacuum, right? It has a very particular political economy to it. And so developmentalism and dispossession, as I said, constitute important sites of subaltern rights talk in South Asia, and also the grounds on which subaltern groups resist and challenge the irresistible power and authority of the state. This developmentalism and its rights talk produces its own particular forms of governmentalized power, including modes of questioning, setting off what I've called in the book, and I won't go into it because I don't have time, but I've called counter-development. Vernacular rights cultures signal the overlapping and intersecting nature of the languages of rights and those of human rights, rather than insisting on either historical continuity or separation. In doing so, they resist theoretical foreclosure by sidestepping the paradox between the rights of man and the rights of citizen that characterize much of human rights debates in Anglo-European and North Atlantic world. If anything, vernacular rights cultures show that rights of man, rights of citizen, codependent, intersectional, struggled for, intricately interwoven rather than only involved in paradoxical relationships. The epistemic presence of vernacular rights cultures crucially disrupts two assumptions of global human rights discourse: universal and unidirectional translatability and radical commensurability. Now, the politics of origins insist on the unidirectional travel of global human rights from a specific location, but also that insistence that these become localized or vernacularized through translation into local contexts into different languages. However, vernacular rights cultures refuse this demand and also insistence on straightforward and simple translational global human rights practice, to speak instead of different politics, meanings, epistemic authority, subjectivities, and political cultures of rights and justice and for human of human rights struggles. They interrupt state-centric, but also well-rehearsed originary stories, as I was saying earlier, of temporalities, global institutional histories, and abstract subjectivities, and to generate historically specific discourses of rights, which are replete with their own languages of claim-making, subjectification, world-making. Vernacular rights cultures, like all phenomena, are gendered, and the attention to conceptual work around the globe draws attention to the gendered conceptual life and the work of concepts. And even while Huck generates political possibilities and shifts normative horizons of right stock, however, these normative possibilities are deeply gendered and marked by intersectional inequalities and conflict. It is worth noting, as I was saying earlier to you, that in each of these cases of political mobilizations that I've been studying and documenting, I have not come across a single instance where the demand for gender equality came up organically within these mobilizations or was raised as part of collectively raised demand for rights. So always a separate thing, always an added on. And this is, very familiar. We see that, right? We see that across the globe, women's caucuses in political parties, for example, right? And women's wings and various things. So always having to make that separate extra case, an additional case, rather than them it being actually intersectional. The temporality of these rights mobilizations places a mild question mark on some of the contemporary scholarship on neoliberalism that ascribes to it, among other global effects, the imminent death of the homo politicus. However, far from neoliberalism ringing in the impending death of the homo politicus, these mobilizations have not only engendered novel activist strategies to demand innovative public policies, but have also been successful at expanding existing sets of rights and entitlements. So whenever people sort of say, oh, well, the death of the political citizen across the globe, and I always ask them, where are you looking? And who and what are you looking at, right? And that kind of question of depoliticization is and it's really interesting that how the case studies or the examples of that, even in the most radical critical theories, are so based in the Euro-Atlantic world, and they're not looking at where that rights politics and the forms it's taking across the globe. And so the depoliticization of for whom and of whom, right? And where, I want to always ask. Finally, it's certainly the case that rights and human rights talk set off processes of subjectification. We know that, it's certainly the case. And here I think Rancière is right. However, this subjectification does not result in the production of a homogeneous, sovereign and free subject of global human rights, but a subject of rights in the vernacular, one inflected by very particular and specific political histories, political economies, and materialities of dispossession and injustice. Consequently, the politics of rights and human rights in most of the world is not one only of simply enacting or reproducing the global subject of human rights, or indeed of translating global human rights into the local. It is instead a politics of struggle for justice that is materially, intersectionally, geopolitically located from specific and within specific, historically specific encounters with rights and human rights in most of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sumi. This is such a tremendously rich presentation. Amazing. Yeah, that's better. Now we can see everyone. Great. So I have a whole series of notes and questions, but I'm first going to hand over to Rafif, who I'm sure also has a list of notes and questions and comments. So Rafif, please.
Thank you very much, Jelka, and thank you very much, Sumi. Jelka, thank you for bringing us together. This was a huge effort. It was canceled a few times because of the strikes, and I'm glad we respected the strike days to finally have this conversation with everyone joining us. And thank you, Sumi, for writing such a tremendous book. I really enjoyed reading it. I was reading part of it on the picket lines, part of it trying to catch up with work. So it was really a pleasure to read. I think it's one of those books that you keep going back to and discovering more each time you go back to it. So it's extremely rich, it's multi-layered, but it's also a book that I appreciated because it doesn't give easy answers. Even on the question of decolonization, for example, you say that you don't think it's just a simple, easy process of going back to old ways, but actually having to understand that things have shifted. And there's no simply a harking back to some absolute great history, but that there have been complications that exist because of the way colonialism and even post-colonialism has developed. I really appreciate the disruption of the origin story. I think for a few decades now, and particularly for many people who went through the anti-war movement when it came to the war on Iraq, we've been involved in critiquing the way human rights gets utilized. There's a lot of feminist work, of course, on feminist imperialism. And what I like about the book is that you do not dismiss this work. You center that critique and say how important that critique has been, but you also push us beyond that critique. You have tried to push us beyond that story of the origin story and what you call the unidirectional movement of human rights to a more complicated story that takes in the majority world, essentially. But within that pushing around the origin story, you have also looked at the Eurocentrism inherent within these critiques. And for me, that was extremely useful to looking at these critiques by authors that we use quite often, Balibar amongst others, and seeing that still, even within that critique that has become common, although I should put a parenthesis here that it's not common to everyone, there's still a lot of work to be done, but even within that critique, we still rely on an extremely Eurocentric epistemology. And we have seen more work nowadays, I think, especially within critical legal studies, for example, trying to situate like the Haitian Revolution within those moments of revolutions that are continuously centered. So here you're not just pushing us to a different origin story, but pushing our critique of the unidirectional human rights, which I really, really appreciated. On a methodological note, I wanted to say, especially if any students are watching us, there is extremely important methodological work and grounding that happens right at the start of the book that I think helps us to follow the story throughout and follow the argument throughout. You kind of passed through it quickly in your presentation, but I think the feminist historical ontology that you are speaking about is a real piece of artwork, actually, when it comes to methodology and how one can situate both history, but also the feminist work on positionality through looking at social mobilization. Not all feminist work tends to do that. There is sometimes a presentism in how we think about social movements. And the fact that here we are kind of going beyond that presentism, but also going beyond the simplistic positionality, where one declares the positionality, but then we don't do the work, the analytical work through of what does that positionality mean. For me, this was really useful in thinking through how do we use positionality and historicize things at the same time. The book, by its very nature, although not necessarily always spelled out in your face, is a call against methodological nationalism, because the social mobilizations you look at throughout the book in themselves act against methodological nationalism. And this is something that's always interesting to me when looking at post-colonial states, and we also know that in many instances, it's not just post-colonial states we're looking at, there's continuing colonialism in many states. The social mobilizations themselves defy the idea of methodological nationalism. Even if we want to impose this methodological nationalism, social movements, social mobilizations, by their very nature are defying it because they act across borders. And this really comes through methodologically. So these are the things that I really appreciated about the book, and the richness of the ethnography as well. Unfortunately, books tend to be either very theoretically rich or ethnographically rich, and you've managed to do both at the same time. But again, as you mentioned, not in this way where you are using the cases as, here's my theory and here's my case study. I could really see how through the case studies, the theory was happening and they were really working with each other, not as separate sections, but really playing off of each other, and the mobilizations were informing the theory and vice versa. Having said all this, I come to this conversation from a very different geography. And part of why I was excited about this conversation on haqq is that it's a very large debate, of course, within the Middle East. And particularly if you look at Palestine, it's a very huge debate around human rights, conceptions of human rights. How do we integrate human rights into the discourse, knowing very well the very illegitimate ways that it could be used against people seeking justice, if we want to keep it as vague as possible. For example, the largest human rights organization in Palestine is actually called Al-Haqq. And here, I think we can take so much from the book, although it's speaking about a specific context, and generalize it to the other places where haqq is used in this way. But I wondered here about the disentanglement of rights in this way. Is there a way where we can just look at a human rights from below? Or are we beyond that point where the entanglement is so heavy that even if you bring up a conversation with the word haqq in it, the Eurocentric European claim to human rights is what comes through? In the Palestinian context, there's a huge debate around are we using human rights and the human rights discourse for our own ends when it comes to social movements? Are we witty enough to work against the way that they are often used? And this is a real debate, I think, for social movements beyond the context of Palestine. I think internationally, rights and human rights are such a double-edged sword in the way that they are presented to social movements. And quite often I get very frustrated at, Western activists that come and try to tell people in the Middle East, well, human rights are actually Eurocentric and it's a terrible discourse, as if people haven't realized that, having been on the receiving end of it for decades. But at the same time, there is a debate around, are they a shackle that you can break through? Are they something that you can use in relation to social movements? How do you use them? Do we completely reject them? Or is there a human rights from below that can be utilized in the way that you are speaking about in this book? Having said that, the politics person within me also wants to ask that political question around, doesn't it have to do with the nature of the social mobilization and the power and the sources behind a social mobilization? Part of the turn to a human rights discourse in the Middle East context has also been a systematic destruction of opposition movements, political parties that were in the opposition, and human rights kind of became the last resort of escape for many mobilizations. So I just wanted to ask you here around the political nature of the social mobilization. When they do utilize the rights in this particular way, what are the political dynamics we are speaking about? What are the social forces behind them? And can they articulate a human rights from below that is disentangled from the human rights from above? I should say this language of above and below is my own. It's not yours from the book, but it's just my way of thinking through it as well. So in one way, I'm asking about, is this displacement of the origin story possible? Just as you wrote in the book around decolonization and it not being this harking to the past, is there a way we can do this displacement work when things have become so entangled? And another question is this question about politics and historical traditional currents, oppositional currents, if we want to think a bit more historically about the Bandung moment, let's say, and that kind of claim to rights, how does what you're talking about today in terms of these social movements, does it build on the legacy of these older moments? Is it rejecting these older moments? Is it an exceptionally new and different claim to rights that we haven't seen before? So I just wanted a bit of historicization around opposition and social mobilization. Two last points I wanted to make. I think for our students, especially the ones in development studies, in international development, I would love for you to speak a little bit more on the sections about development workers and their place, and also counter development. I think that would be really crucial for the kind of work that we do within at least international development department. And finally, and I realize this is a big question, so apologies in advance, I wanted to ask you about the future. In terms of what does this kind of theorizing do for the future of these mobilizations? And are you, in terms of your own work, are you thinking of the next step in this research? What is the future of this project? Because I feel there's a lot more to actually be said in following these movements, and I'm just curious what you're thinking through on the next steps are. And again, congratulations on writing the book. It's been a difficult time generally for thinking and theorizing the past few years. So to be able to write a book in this atmosphere, and I know that it took many years before that, the richness of the analysis is there, the richness of the ethnography is fantastic, and it was really a pleasure to read. Thank you.
Can I go and lie down now?
No, just a little while longer. Just hold on to you for a little while now. No, this is amazing, Rafeef. But yeah, do you want to respond?
Oh my, these are Rafeef. As I said, it was such a treat, and I've been so looking forward to this conversation, with yourself. And thank you. I mean, your generosity has just blown me away. Like you said, I just feel like, okay, now I feel so overwhelmed, I need to lie down. So thank you. Wow, these are amazing, fabulous, so thoughtful and careful reflections, obviously coming through so many of your own work, right? It's coming through, all of that work and struggles that you've been such an important part of and are important part of. So, I think it's going to take me about 6 months to answer your questions, right? Also because, I take a long time in thinking through things, because I think that they are all such important things, and I just don't like coming across it as though I'm treating them flippantly, which I'm not. And sometimes there's this kind of thing about, let me come back very quickly and so on. So can I just say a couple of things as I see them, as my, as you were speaking, they were coming through, but they're by no means any kind of proper response to the wonderful things you have said. So thank you very much. I also want to say, you've read the book, and it's such a privilege when that happens, when your book is read, and it's I'm so ever so grateful, really. Thank you. What's the future? So can I just start with that? What is the future for the project? Well, the future for the project, as I ended the book, as I was kind of writing in one of the last pages, I said, more than 300 million people speak Arabic across the globe. And the potential for this kind of thinking is just endless, isn't it? So, we're looking at, the rights politics in different parts of the globe, and the kinds of meaning making, right, and the claim making and so on, and that's really important work to do, because at the moment what we have is a lack of that kind of conceptual and theoretical work. So one of our problems with Balipar and Razia, and I might about all the people who I really admire very much, I have to say, I make it clear that I very much admire them, and I learn from them and so on, and but when they're talking about the rights politics and the difficulties of rights, they're going back 250 years to the French Revolution and the American Declaration. We've got problems coming out here, but it's always the kind of the harking back by the radical democratic theorists, which always gets me. And I'm sort of thinking, why do you have to, look at those as the paradigmatic cases of human rights politics? And what about the rights politics right now? And I think the future for the project is really, and if I could get someone to give me a couple of million, in a grant, it would be to have, with colleagues, have a big transnational solidaristic, project mapping and a cartography of hack across the globe, right? I mean, that's the future of it. And because what that would do then would kind of, force the kind of folks and people to work on the kind of monumental histories, right, of human rights, right? So the kinds of international human rights law, and all that kind of stuff, which actually has such a bearing on this rights politics, but those folks are entirely non-cognizant of what's going on, right? And so therefore, that is why you see all of these difficulties. I mean, yes, it is the anti-colonial and the Palestinian struggle is the big case in point, right, about the epistemic erasure of rights politics, right, of anti-colonial rights politics and all this, but also the other kinds, right? So for example, via Campesina, right? The campesinos, 500 million people, 500,000, a group of people and so on involved in that. And yes, you do have right to food security and so on, but that doesn't encompass the kinds of questions of food sovereignty, right, which are very much at the heart of so much that's going on. So there is a lot of stuff around rights politics, which I think needs to be looked at conceptually and theoretically, and to matter epistemically, so that when people talk about rights, so that people start talking about rights politics rather than global human rights, which has a very particular history and so on. And I think it's the kind of that epistemic presence of rights politics in most of the world. So that's my think about the future. So yes, the future, I have plans. I think it's about, and I'm hoping that, people, like-minded colleagues and people and students and, get together, and then we could put together this big kind of intervention, because it has to have that weight, and that, so that we have this sort of critical mass of rights politics, work on rights politics in much of the world. So about the Bandon claim to rights, I'm just going that way because I think that those are things I could kind of respond to a little bit more. Whereas the other massive questions that you have, I'm going to have to take a while. The historicization of these movements within social mobilizations, these social mobilizations that and one of the things I did was that I refused to kind of focus on leaders of these mobilizations, right? So I don't have the kind of, because I didn't want, again, methodologically, it would have been odd, right? To kind of remove yourself from great men's history and then suddenly, speak to only the great men and a couple of great women within those mobilizations. So, I haven't. I spoke to some and so on and so forth, and I've got there, but because I wanted to get away from that methodologically. And so most of these activists on the ground and people, participants in these social mobilizations they are politically literate, but they are not formally literate in that sense. So that kind of, thinking around, and so therefore the stories of where Huck come from becomes really important, right? And so on and so forth. So it's not tracked to those kinds of nation state kind of methodological nationalism in some ways you were talking about, primarily because the stories that anchor this politics are very different, and they come from very different historical experience. So so I know that a lot of the kind of revisionary histories of the monumental kind of work on global human rights now kind of looks at Bandung and so on. It's very interesting. But again, there is a nation state stuff within it, which is like all these nation states. Okay, so it's not that, it's probably, the conference in Bandung or the conference in Iran, or the Tehran conference and so on and so forth. And then who is milling at these, right? And so again, it's the same kind of thing, which again, I find a bit worrisome, primarily because, anyway. And then so when you were so that was just, I just thought I'd say that because it's not, the narrative is very different because it comes from a place of people who are not formally literate and so on, and their histories or experience are very different. You asked about the really important question about, and it's massive, that question about human rights being double-edged swords, and particularly the ways in which they have played out in the Middle East, right? Particularly in the Palestinian question. It's, and then you linked it up very, very importantly to social mobilizations and the political framework of social mobilizations as being really key to how the politics turns out, right? And so on. And so therefore you see, and of course, human rights, I'm not surprised, that human rights politics, or not politics, but human rights discourses, right? Not the politics. The human rights framework has become the last resort because it is also a minimalist discourse. This is not the monumental global human rights discourse, it's a minimalist discourse. It says nothing about justice, says nothing about inequality. It's like, about how do we redeem from suffering, right? And so on and so forth. So it's that very minimalist kind of framework. And so therefore also thoroughly depoliticized. And I think one of the biggest problems in international human rights discourse is that the fact that they have managed to hold on to this very depoliticizing frame. But of course, rights politics doesn't exist, and that's the problem, right? And that's why that they don't speak with each other at all. This rights politics, messy, conflictual, dealing with questions of justice, dispossession, settler colonial, politics, racism, and so on. And then you've got the international human rights law and international human rights framework, which is talking about universal global human rights being universal. And so, that very depoliticizing sort of discourse, and definitely, so it requires a broader political framework. I think that's what the Vernacular Rights Cultures does, is that it kind of sort of says, there's a politics to this. The politics comes out of very particular forms of activism, makes very particular kinds of demands, and so on and so forth. So this is not that depoliticized framework, and so politics is at the center of it. And I absolutely agree with you that so this kind of depoliticizing discourse of competing rights, for example, and all that kind of thing, right? We're very familiar with that. So I think that so I think, but maybe I should have put that out much more strongly than it did come through, that there is that the rights politics is extreme, is the key. So when you sort of say, shouldn't it be about, shouldn't social mobilizations have a that the political nature of social mobilizations are the key things? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That is really important. And that's why it's a political activist they've gone after, right? All these states, they go after political activists. I mean, after all, there is something going on there that they want to kind of decimate any kind of oppositional struggle or movement, but they tolerate the human rights thing primarily because it comes from, it's funded by particular groups of people, it's recognized in very particular kinds of forums, and it makes very particular kinds of claims and erases all the others, right? So we know that. And I think that, that question that you were saying earlier, which I think is a really, really important question, and I have to think about it a lot more, but is about whether the displacement of the origin story, is the displacement of the origin story possible when things are so entangled, right? And what are the social, can one think about disentangling human rights from above and below? Yes, is that right? Somewhere there, yes, right. And I think that is linked to the political nature of social mobilization in some ways, isn't it? I think they are all kind of, they are coming out of that way of thinking, right? And I think that, I think analytically it's important to make that distinction, because they are saying, they are making very particular kinds of interventions, but but they're also feeding off each other, if you see what I mean, right? So human rights activists that that I'm very close to and I work with, use the UN Fora Geneva to kind of go and do the reportage, right, of human rights violations, on the periodic reporting and so on and so forth, and so, it's, there are all of these things, and I think about using all these different tools, and I think that one needs to think about them as tools, that these groups use across the globe, really, while centering the political framework, right? And I think that you're absolutely right. It is a political framework that makes a difference.
Thank you so much, Sumi and Rafif, for the excellent comments that generate more reflections. I'd like to invite anyone in the audience, if you have a question, just put up your raise hand function on the Zoom, and then we can unmute you. You can just ask your questions. So please do raise your hand. And while you're mobilizing your thoughts to ask that question, I'll ask a question. So I really, really like this idea of hack, and this is completely out of my linguistic knowledge. And I work on Latin America, as you know, so it's a different region, different language, different. Nevertheless, in Latin America, there are also different ontologies and hence epistemologies of rights that are different from the sort of the idea of the universality of rights. So is this something that you have, do you see, to what extent are you sort of married to the idea of hack, or do you think that there is that there are comparable ideas or movements around politics of rights of the world, in Latin America mainly? Or I can even think about North America, Australia, in indigenous communities. It's a different linguistic tradition.
Yeah. Yes, there are. I mean, I'm director, right?
Yeah.
Yes, so that's so the thing is that vernacular rights cultures is a framework. You can have any other concepts associated, right? So hack is the one that I've been working on and most familiar with, but I would imagine director would be, something that tracking that goes under it, or various other, words for a right that occur, or claim making, right? It doesn't even have to. And so one things against, this kind of, which I've sort of said, the unidirectional translation, right? The impulse to have a direct correspondence, right? That's how translation, that simplistic translation, which kind of expects that there will be radical commensurability, and so on. And I think one of the ways of kind of disrupting that is also to look at the kinds of various languages of claim making, right? And which, and so as it happens, in Spanish and so on, people use derecho. So it would be really fascinating for me, for scholars and students and so on, to kind of start tracking that, the use of derecho within those mobilizations, right? And so on and so forth. So our possibilities are endless. Because that's the framework, and the concepts will then differ depending on the site of articulation, right? And so the concept here is hack, but the framework is the BRC. So and there are different epistemologies, ontologies. Yeah, I mean, I again very much admire Escobar and his work on the pluribus, for example, and I think it's really important. And I do talk about it in the book. In fact, I met him at Helsinki a couple of years ago, and we had a really, really interesting couple of days of conversations. The only thing that worries me about Escobar's, articulation of the pluribus, of course, is that although he sort of cites, he sort of talks about decolonial feminist scholars and so on, it's not clear to me how he deals with questions of power relations, right? So there is a kind of evacuation of power relations within some of the work on the pluribus, which kind of worries me, because for me, questions of conflict, power, intersectional relations are quite key, very key actually, to understanding how mobilizations work. So as I was saying earlier, these are not flat concepts.
Yeah.
They're not horizontal. So yes, they articulate a very different understanding of the cosmos and ontologies and so on. But there is that worry that in order to do that, in that rush to think in terms of universal designs and so on, there is an evacuation of power. Obviously, you know more about that than I do, but that's my reading of.
No, I think it's excellent, and I can't wait. As you know, I haven't been able to read your book yet, but I'm making all these.
Sorry about that. I will be really writing up very.
No, don't worry. Yeah, we'll get it resolved. So you might have addressed it in your book. That was my sort of caveat to this. No, so I might be asking questions that are, did you have addressed otherwise, or that sound a bit odd in relation to the actual book. But what I get from what I read about it and this conversation is and one of the things, so automatically I relate it to my experience in Latin America, and I think your assessment of Escobar and people like him who tend to, there's a tendency to romanticize certain indigenous ontologies that are actually that is not very useful and definitely not very just, no? So, but at the same time, there's an interesting, or I'm wondering, and I will sort of read your book in that, with that in mind, all these ideas around buen vivir, the good living is similar, which is not, it's not about right, but it is about rights. So there is much more local conceptualization of rights than derecho or earth beings, where this idea of who has rights and what is the relationship between the human and the earth and everything around us. So it's that sort of tension that is interesting. But then again, and perhaps that is something you could sort of talk about a little bit more. One of the things that is so clear in Latin America and possibly different from North Africa or from Asia or from the Middle East is that in the end, Latin America is a sort of a settler colony, So there's a big difference between urban elites, educated elites, and rural indigenous peoples. They do not share the same ontology. There's a huge difference. So there is a huge diversity internally, regionally, that is very often in a big clash, particularly because of the paternalism embedded in those relationships between different groups. So I don't know what that does in your context when you talk about hack or about vernacular rights cultures.
Yeah, no, there's really important things. So the word hack is actually quite interesting because you just talked about the distinction between, and I think that's where the coloniality scholars are so important, aren't they? Because they're sort of, they're drawing attention precisely, so Brazil becomes independent in 1835, I think so. But then, of course, you've got all of those kind of, structures of coloniality in place, continuing those colonial relations, and that kind of, and I think that's why I find the decolonial scholars really important, because they talk about the coloniality exists after colonialism has ended, right? So that those structures of coloniality are in place, those kinds of racist heteropatriarchal colonial structures, and that there are different there are different ontologies of and of course they have spoken about them, the pluriverse. So is you talk about Bruno Weber, but Pachamama, there are all these various ways of thinking about being in the world, and that's why there is a very strong kind of focus on ontology, where again I have a little bit of a conversation, because of course the tradition of post-colonial, anti-colonial Black feminist scholarship, has insisted on the, on the coupling actually of epistemology and ontology, right? That, that you cannot uncouple them because which epistemologies matter very much to do with questions of, whiteness, for example, right? Epistemic authority and so on and so forth. So, Frantz Fanon is talking about that and so on. So you have a very particular tradition which has always insisted, and then of course the ontological turn kind of does not pay attention to that tradition, right? And then you're like, oh, okay, well, what's going on here? And so so there is that, but the point you were making about the different vocabularies, the conceptual grammars and critical vocabularies between, say, indigenous groups or between urban and rural elites and, and divide and so on. And the thing with Huck is that it's really interesting because the people, all my kind of interlocutors, across the 2 decades have sort of said, well, Huck actually is, it's the educated people will not use the word Huck, right? The educated people will use another word for a right, which is a Hindi word called adhikar. So they will use that, and that's very much related to power and institutional power. And the translation of the literate folks is is in those terms. Huck belongs to us, right? We are these folks, right, who use this language. Now, the interesting thing, of course, Huck is that it as I said, it has a very interesting trajectory. It comes through various kinds of linguistic traditions and cuts across, whereas in a lot of parts of Huck is associated with Islamic jurisprudentialism. It is not associated with Islamic jurisprudentialism in many parts of South Asia, where these groups use it outside. They're not Islamic groups, right? They don't use that as part of jurisprudential frameworks. But it is very much seen as subaltern in that sense. It's also seen as non-formal literate. But interestingly, Huck is an Urdu word. Urdu is a national language of Pakistan. Only 8% of Pakistanis actually speak Urdu, and it is much less spoken in India formally in terms of the formal census. I think less than 3 or 4% or even less people speak Urdu formally in India. But yet the word, of course, cuts across that and is used by people who don't formally see themselves as speaking either of the languages, right? And so it's kind of, that's why I was sort of saying, yes, it's, it's spoken by these subaltern groups, whereas Urdu, of course, enjoys the privilege of the great, esteem of being the lingua franca of a state, but, it's spoken by less than 8% of the people. So it's quite interesting, but also it's a language which cuts across borders. And at this point, particularly in India, but also in Pakistan, I don't want to romanticize, but it's also the language of anti-colonial poetry. It's a language of revolutionary resistance, right? It's where recently the Urdu poet, Faiz, whose poetry sort of ignites both political mobilizations in India and Pakistan. His songs are sung across the borders, has been banned in schools in India. So you can sort of see that, there is something about that language which has that kind of power, which goes across. And yet it's not, it's not the dominant language, however you might look at it, except for in Pakistan, in institutional terms it is, but only in institutional terms. But certainly not in India. So it's quite interesting. So it would be interesting to see what others of those, kind of languages go across.
Absolutely.
Like this one does.
Yeah, politics of language is very interesting. And I just want to, the breadth of your scholarship here and the different disciplinary angles that you managed to draw in to this is amazing. So it's a great achievement. Are there any questions from the audience? You can just raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can speak up. Please do. If you're shy, you can put it in the chat if you're.
While they do that, I was just thinking that actually Rafi would ask me to address that question of development, because as Rafi was saying, the students,
please.
So if nobody's raised or is taking a while, Is there one, Leah?
Oh, there is one.
You have a
Yuri.
question now, yes. So you should be able to talk now.
Okay, hello?
Yeah, great, go for it.
Oh,
Yiru?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
yes.
Oh, thank you. I'm very interested, and I agree with many of the angles to the sort of complexity of the around the subject of human rights discourse. And what I would like to ask is if you can sort of describe a sort of a utopia that in the future, or like if so the ideal state of the way things, the way human rights can be represented, like linguistically and like across cultures. And can you like describe such a utopia?
Thank you so much, Hiro. Sumi, I'm going to ask you, considering there's 3 minutes left till the end, you just respond, and anything else that you want to respond to so far, those are your 3 minutes.
Thank you, Euro. You ask a very difficult question. It's super tough. And I think that only because somebody might turn around and say, well, are human rights the right kind of language to describe a utopia in, right? There might be other ways of thinking about utopia and whether human rights, the languages of rights lend themselves to a utopia. And I think that one way that we could think about that would be to look at actually, when we try and think about the language of rights and the language of justice coming together, then it's not utopia, but it certainly means that we are reorienting it towards, towards sort of moving away from the kinds of things that blight people's lives, right? That make life unlivable and so unlivable in the world, right? And I think that so those are the kinds of things that one could ask. One could sort of ask of, whether those rights demands and claim making that are coming from a position of, of unlivability for a lot of these mobilizations. And if that demand is sort of, what is that critique directed at? And you'd find that that critique is directed at the conditions that make life unlivable, right? And those conditions could be, conditions of corporate greed, extractivism, dispossession, settler colonialism, racist violence, heteropatriarchal murders, and so on, right? So you see all of those kinds of demands, but also redistribution, right? So economic redistributive justice are certainly some of the things that came up very strongly in the work, in the mobilizations I've been tracking, and also, and it's really interesting that they were also looking at using the language of cosmology, for example, right? Of what might be, so not utopia in that sense, but really thinking about how that particular kind of way of being in the world has been so violated. And so demanding a restitution of that through the language of rights becomes one way of restoring, if you like, some kind of justice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you.
Okay, I think I should stop now because I think that everyone would be really tired by now.
Thank you so much, Sumi. Well, you must be exhausted by now.
Now that you stopped me from having a lie down after Rafif had spoken because I was so overwhelmed, I think I'm okay now. I can go on now, Rafif. Thank you. For a couple of days, I can go on.
Thank you so much, both of you, Rafif as well, for your excellent comments and for your. It's as Sumi already said at the start. It's really nice to hear another person speak about a particular work, because it shifts the language, if only because we all use slightly different words in order to describe something. So it's super interesting and very useful. So thank you, both of you, for being here today. And for your wonderful book, Sumi. Thank you to the audience for coming out this Monday afternoon and joining us for this. And I wish everyone a lovely, lovely Monday evening and a lovely week. Thank you.
Thank you.